Alright, time for a Fake Physicser of the Week award winner. Yeah, and this week's it's Up and Atom. So I guess I'll have to subscribe just to see what kind of crap she's doing currently. Yeah, annoying. But anyway, so this was a video from, say, 3 years ago, the double slit experiment light as a wave. So I watched about 30 seconds and oh, you know, there's just so much wrong with this girl physics stuff. You know, let's make it all cute and fun. It really is annoying. So, I have no idea where it's going to go, but you can just tell it's not going anywhere reasonable. And just the idea of the Young's double slit experiment, again. I think anybody who really looks at the history at all understands that Young is not an interesting character in the progression from Newton's rings to the 1930 decision to turn photons officially into wavicles.
Double slit experiment. The experiment that proved that light was a wave.
Yeah, well, it didn't do any of that. It certainly, whatever that is. So why don't you draw me a picture of this mechanics? Show me the mechanics of this wave. What moves where, and what is a what? Are there any whats at all? You know, any things actually in your physics, like physical things? It's hilarious.
So back in the 17th century, this guy, I don't know if you've heard of him, Isaac Newton, he thought the light was made up of particles, which he called...
Humor. Yeah, I don't think he knew exactly what to say it was, but whatever, fine. He tended to think it was, but he didn't go with the Lesage theory. He did for a while, Fadio. For 10 years, he thought it was a good idea.
Called corpuscles, which is actually just a fancy word for particles. I don't know why he didn't just call them.
No, well, because one is just more ambiguous. A corpuscle is basically just saying it's a clump. You're allowed more discretion. When you say particle, that's a very explicit, more explicit statement. So he was just being careful, unlike modern physics.
Particles, but, I'm sure he had his reasons. It was Newton. So Newton published his paper on the corpuscular theory of light. And a lot of the other physicists were kind of like, no, Newton, that doesn't explain...
No, Newton. No, Newton. It's just, oh, man. Well, anyway, I'm sure he just appreciates this, so much. But anyway, well, there's not much to say.
Diffraction.
I guess this is why he died a virgin, He's just, nothing good can happen.
No, Newton, that doesn't explain polarization. No, Newton, what the heck is a corpuscle?
Yes, like you've explained polarization. So, like you have a theory of polarization. No, you don't. You don't. So,
the theory was obviously pretty flawed, but nobody had any...
Yeah, it wasn't obviously pretty flawed. It was stuck in a dilemma, and it took us 300 years to make up a fake choice, and then we didn't even... You're so uncommitted to your choice that you play this idiotic wave-particle duality nonsense, because you can't even commit, even though you clearly have committed to wave privately. You're too embarrassed by your lack of evidence to commit authoritatively.
Real evidence to prove Newton wrong. And because Newton was such a big name at the time, the theory stuck around for over 100 years.
So I'm sure he appreciates this crap too. I hope somebody in the future paints a little Hitler mustache on you or something. What the fuck is that? It's just a lack of respect, frankly.
Until this other pretty cool guy, Thomas Young, came along with his famous double slit.
And famous for what reason? Absolutely no good reason. Fucking I know this
Split
crap.
Experiment. That
Yeah, I'm glad it interrupted you. You deserve that interruption. Well, what's all this hand jive crap? Anyway, so again, this just demonstrates just a complete ignorance of history, an ignorance of what was known and how it got to be known. Young's experiment didn't demonstrate, oh, there's two patterns in the double slit pattern. There's the envelope. It didn't do any of that stuff. It did what Newton had already demonstrated, which is light is diffracted by small impediments, hairs. Newton did the experiment, are openings. And they were called Newton's rings. So again, Young did nothing remarkable at all. That's why physics didn't do anything with Young's great experiment for 130 years. It's because it had no clue that it could mean anything. Yeah.
went something like this. So we have our two slits, double slits.
Yeah.
Now we're going to place a light source directly behind the two slits so that when we turn it on...
Like we don't have enough crappy emanations already. So they have to make more... we'll do our own little crappy animation.
The light will shine directly through the slits. So now we've got our light source, two...
Yeah, well, why don't you do it with one slit? Okay, because you don't need to. Because I'm sure you're not going to do the double slit pattern. Well, I shouldn't say it. I shouldn't presume she's not going to be inaccurate, but, do it with one slit and you get the pattern. Explain the one slit pattern with a rational explanation.
Slits, and some distance away, like a far, far distance away, we have a detection plane.
Yes, you project the image, like any projection. The screen for a movie has to be away from the screen to make it big. If it's really close to the projector, it's really small. So yes, you project it to magnify it.
And this is usually just a screen or something just to show where the light is actually hitting.
Yes, something to magnify the pattern. So they can't even get the purpose of the distance right. The distance is the pattern's diverging. With distance, the image gets bigger and bigger, so then you can see it.
Now we'll turn on the light source and shine the light through our two slits. So if light were...
Yeah, so if it was single photons is what you have to do it with, because frankly there's no point in talking about it in any other circumstance, because the fact is you get the same pattern with single photons. Single photons.
A particle like what Newton was saying, we should see these two really bright spots on the...
Right, so this again is just more nonsense. So Isaac Newton does the single slit experiment 350 years ago, and here they are still talking like you would expect. No, Newton already told you, the guy you made fun of already explained to you that that's not going to happen, that the light's going to diverge and create a pattern. Newton's rings.
Detection plane, right? Directly in line with the slits. If you need a real-world translation of this, imagine that you...
So if you wanted to do these stupid animations, you could have said, well, if you threw sand, what would you expect the sand to do? Well, yes, some of it would hit edges and bounce and make a wide pattern here and a wide pattern here, but there wouldn't be any bar pattern, blah, 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 blah. But to use light with the expectation, again, that it goes through any small aperture without diverging and creating a pattern would be incorrect going all the way back to Newton. It would have been incorrect 350 years ago. When you're still saying it 350 years later, what does that indicate? But a lack of detail. Just you don't really care about the truth.
You have a table with a hole in it, and you're pouring sand all around this hole. There's going to be a huge amount of sand directly under the hole, right?
Yes, so we've all figured out that sand isn't photons. Wow! Physics, that would be kind of a silly comparison. That's sort of like comparing photons to raindrops or something like that. It's just kind of silly.
Nothing fancy is happening.
Or like comparing atoms to a brick wall. Kind of a dumb comparison, wouldn't it be? When we know the atom's 90% or 99% empty space? Yeah, that's kind of a silly comparison.
The particles of sand are just falling directly under the hole or directly in line with it. Well, because light doesn't really make a mound, where the most light is hitting is going to show up as the brightest spot on the detection plane, or have the highest intensity.
Well, I don't even know who you're talking to, somebody that stupid. Yes, we understand that. More photons hit. Yes.
Intensity. So if light were a particle/corpuscle, we should see these two bright spots of high intensity on the detection plane, right?
No. Again, it's already done by Newton, the guy you made fun of. Already told you that's not what's going to happen, because photons aren't sand.
Well, that's not what happened. What Young saw on the detection...
So again, what Young saw. No, what Newton had already discovered 150 years before Young.
...plane instead was this. This is...
and that is a silly representation of any double-slit experiment or the single-slit experiment. It's just a crappy animation. The average pattern, you know, you can get 30 bars, easy. And you show 3.
It's the part that proved light was a wave.
Yeah, it doesn't prove anything to anybody who's a scientist, because scientists know, oh yeah, there's lots of seems like but isn't like. There's lots of things that can fool you. You got to be a little careful. Scientists know you have to be careful before you jump to a conclusion. And this is so far from proof of a wave, when your whole wave theory depends on idiotic notions that light's going to go slower as it goes near the surfaces. It's going to create a bulge somehow, that somehow it's going to imitate water when it's not a medium. I mean, you're so proud of the failure of the Michelson-Morley experiment, because, wow, that gets rid of this whole ether problem, and then you just go back into believing in ethers. Without tension, you can't round the wave. Huygens can't work without tension.
Oh! Let me break it down. Now if we imagine
this baby talk.
light as a wave, when we turn on the light source, we'll get these waves emanating from the source. So you're probably used to seeing waves as squiggly sine waves, right? And this is convenient because this tells us the amplitude. But the drawback is that they're only...
Amplitude of what? Oh, electric fields and magnetic fields. Fields of what? Nothing. You have no physical physics in your physics. You just have silly representations of something that have nothing to do with anything real.
Only one-dimensional. For this diagram to make sense, we need to see the waves in 2D because we need to see the whole wavefront. If you don't...
Well, why don't you just see them in 3D?
Know what a wavefront is, or you don't really know what I mean, I've drawn a little picture, so hopefully this helps. As you can...
It's not even a useful picture because, frankly, your photon, by your own description, doesn't look like loaves of bread. You know, it's supposed to be oscillating in 2 fields.
You can see my artistic skill isn't quite developed enough for 3D drawings, but the idea is to show...
Well, I thought you were just going for a 2D drawing.
You what wavefronts are, and that the lines represent the peaks and the trough of the waves.
So, again, just mush, you know, again, and how does this defeat a corpuscle theory? It doesn't defeat it at all. But anyway, let's go on.
So the full lines are the peaks, and the dotted lines are the troughs.
Which means as the waves propagate, the peaks and the troughs should be doing the same thing that they do with water. And instead of getting a bar pattern, you should have a flickering pattern. You know, light goes on and off here in the middle, and it just stays gray in all the other spots. So again, just more crap.
So we have waves emanating from the source. Now when the wavefronts come into contact with the slits, because of wave diffraction, the waves diffract around the slits, forming...
So more nonsense. Okay, Professor Lewin would say that's just absolute nonsense. And how does this diffraction, what is the process of your diffraction? Huygens? Why do photons stick to each other and create a round wave? Why do they do that? Oh, that's right, no good reason.
Cylindrical waves. Now these cylindrical
So, again, just more nonsense.
waves continue moving forward until they reach the detection plane. So now we have two sets of cylindrical waves.
Brilliant. Yes, and you didn't explain why photons would make any such kind of wave, or how they spread in all these directions at one time. And the fact is, they land in one single location, again, just like a corpuscle. They land as a corpuscle, and you're going to tell me we've proven they're waves, even though they land just like a corpuscle. And mathematically, you can trace them, no problem, through a path. So, it doesn't mean anything as a proof.
And because they came from the same source, they have the same amplitude, same frequency, same wavelength. What's this?
Yes, well, obviously the same frequency requires the same wavelength, so more double speak or whatever, half speak.
Seems like we've got two identical monochromatic light waves overlapping in and out of phase. That's right, guys. We've got both constructive and destructive interference happening here.
Yeah, and never been proven in any way whatsoever, ever, that there's any destructive or constructive interference. Just corpuscles landing in locations. So all you've got as evidence is that there's the same angle deflection. 3 degrees, 6 degrees, 9 degrees, 12 degrees. That's all you've got. A consistent, the simplest pattern you can possibly make in the universe. And the photons, when you send them in single photons at a time, end up in those locations. So your theory is that these waves of light, these corpuscles, these things that always land as a tiny little dot, whether they go through a slit or not, somehow went through both slits and created two simultaneous waves that interfered with each other, and then it decided to land in one location. All of its energy went to one single location. Didn't spread, didn't do any of this stuff. And you're saying that's your proof. It's garbage as a proof. This clearly doesn't prove anything.
Remember how the full lines are the peaks of the wave and the dotted lines are the troughs of the wave? So where the peaks are overlapping with the peaks and the troughs are overlapping with the troughs, we get constructive interference. Where the peaks are overlapping with the troughs, we get destructive interference. Now something...
So we get double photon and no photon. Double photon, no photon.
Something a bit strange happens. We get these kind of perfect straight paths of interference. Let's take the center path for an example. If we locate all the places where constructive interference is occurring, we get these kind of...
Occurring every one cycle. In your same cycle, there's destructive interference. In the same path, there's total destructive interference. So again, it just, begs credulity. It doesn't do what water waves do. Water waves go up and down, all the way up in one location, and then they just do the neutral thing in the other location, and all the way up and all the way down in the other, So, not the same thing at all.
Of perfect straight lines of constructive interference. In other words, we get these perfect lines of high intensity because the amplitude is getting bigger, we're going to have a higher intensity. And this forms a bright spot on the detection plane. Now if we look at the overlaps directly next to this path, we're going to see a perfect straight line of destructive interference. Because of the wave amplitudes cancelling out, the intensity goes to 0, which leaves a dark spot on the detection plane. So if we find all these paths of interference and follow them to the detection plane, we'll see a bright spot here, and here, and here, and a dark spot here, here, here.
So, just again, a very dull pattern. Look at, and then look at how they gave it these nice little fuzzy edges. Isn't that cute? When photons don't do that.
Yeah. And here. This is what's called an interference pattern, and they are totally characteristic of...
No, this is what should be called by a scientist a pattern. A really simple pattern. A repetitive, simple pattern. Can be caused by something other than interference.
Of waves. If you ever see an interference pattern, you know that waves are involved.
And where did you see an interference pattern? Where else, but when you do these silly slit experiments, where else do you see this thing you call an interference pattern, which is always just, again, an angle, a multiplied angle?
I guess I could have just told you that in the beginning, but where would be the fun in that?
So there was no indication of the two patterns, no conversation about the real complexity of the double slit experiment, which is the fact that there are two patterns superimposed on each other. No explanation for where that comes from, and how their wave explanation, how their wave comparison explains that. Then again, do the multi-slit experiment where you get actual images of what you put into the slits. No explanation for why actual images are going to the different locations, how wave interference creates actual images at all the locations, which a diffraction grating will do. But nothing, no conversation about those facts. So it's just, let's just select the facts that verify our bullshit, and we'll just ignore all the rest of the facts. Like the fact that the single slit creates just as detailed a pattern, it's just missing the double pattern.
So you may have guessed that they're called interference patterns because they're a result of wave interference.
Yes, they're called something they shouldn't be called until you know that's what's causing them. They're on-off patterns.
Constructive interference causes the bright spots, or sometimes called bright fringes, and destructive interference causes the dark spots, or dark fringes.
Merely says you, based on very, very little real evidence, very inconsistent evidence, evidence that has all over it counter evidence. The counter evidence of the single photon in the experiment doesn't do any of this stuff by any rational understanding. There's no reason to think photons are so big they can go through two slits and they create wave functions and do all this crap and then turn back into something called a photon. Your theory is desperately unevidenced. I mean, it's grotesquely unevidenced. And here you are declaring that, oh yeah, we've proven something. You hadn't come close to proving anything.
You may have noticed that the middle bright spot is brighter than the two on the side.
Something that would be obvious if you just point out that this image on the screen is many meters from the two tiny slits that have a tiny profile. The slits, if you put them, they wouldn't even be as big as this purple arrow. If you brought them over to this image, they wouldn't even take up the space of the purple arrow. They're so tiny. So obviously the light that didn't do any of this bending crap goes straight through and to the middle. So that's why the middle is brighter.
I'm gonna leave this one up to you guys to figure out. Let me know in the comments
that's just so cute.
below if you think you got it. So there we have it. Undeniable evidence that light is...
So it's undeniable evidence. So this is what science is supposed to do. Is it shows you a tiny little piece of, they edit the history, the reality, the facts, the experiment. They edit it. Take out the pieces that match what they want to say or what their propaganda is. Ignore all the counter evidence entirely. And ignore doing the story completely or even accurately. They can't get the history right. They can't get the fact that the single slit doesn't do that silly crap that was your expectation, even though Isaac Newton spelled it out for you, and they even gave him Newton's rings. They even titled the rings after him, and you pretend he didn't do it. I mean, it's just so dishonest. It's it's rubbish as educational material. It has nothing to do with the facts. And here you are claiming you proved it in court. What a sham of a court.
Is a wave. So you might be wondering, why don't we see this effect in everyday life? I mean, surely there must be a pair of slim...
Because atoms and photons aren't our everyday life. That's why, because we're only 1 trillion times bigger than they are. That's why they function differently than we do. We are a complex full of billions, hundreds, millions of billions of cells. And those are cells. We're not even, you can't even get to how many atoms we're made out of. Huge, preposterous number. So of course we don't behave the same. Galaxies don't behave the same as the suns they're made out of. Duh.
Like objects lying around somewhere during daylight, right? I mean, what about sunlight coming in through my 2-bedroom windows? Well, there are a couple conditions.
Yeah, no, the only condition there is that obviously you're letting way too much light in. So if you can dim the light, you'll actually probably be able to see a tiny little bit of fringes on the edges of the shadow from the edges of the window. So it's really just a surface phenomenon. And that's another piece of the evidence you've selectively decided to ignore, is that single surfaces also create this consequence. It's just that it's hard to see it with single surfaces because the effect is very subtle. But you're supposed to be able to do subtle things. You can measure you can measure gravity waves from billions of light years away that are just only the thickness of a human hair, and blah 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 blah. You do all these magical things, yet you can't do it when it has something to do with facts that might indicate your theory is garbage.
The first is that the slits need to be around the same size as the wavelength of light for the light to diffract.
Not true. So again, just made up crap. I mean, with the single slit, you can have it almost a ½ millimeter thick, and you get some little indication. But then the narrower you go, the more pattern you'll get, and the only thing that'll happen is the pattern will just keep getting bigger and bigger on the screen. So you got to move the screen closer if you want to see it. And then as it gets smaller and smaller, obviously there's less and less photons going through, so it gets dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. So you might not be able to detect it unless you use maybe some complex things like photographic film, or you actually do an experiment where you actually attempt to detect fringes that are invisible to the naked eye. But you don't do any of those experiments, because that would be scientific, and you couldn't care less about finding the truth. You just want to verify your bullshit.
To put this into perspective...
No, validate your bullshit. You're not verifying it. You're just attempting to fake a validation. You're just trying to give it credibility that it doesn't have. It's fake physics.
Red light has a wavelength of around 700 nanometers. That's over 100 times smaller than the diameter of an average human hair.
Right. So obviously nobody makes slits that small when they do these experiments, frankly. So obviously this wavelength of the light shit is just that shit. Just absolute nonsense.
We're talking about some pretty tiny slits. The second is that
we're talking about surfaces close to each other. And that's what Newton discovered. And it's just so obvious that obviously the smaller I make an aperture, the more likely that any photon I shoot through that hole, the more likely it is it's going to travel near a surface. And if it travels near a surface, it's getting messed up by the electrons and the other stuff that might be hanging around that surface. And it might be reasonable to understand that in quantum electrodynamics, which essentially was the subject of the interaction between photons and electrons, that yes, it seems perfectly reasonable that photons would interact with the electrons and they might be deflected or scattered by that process. And that they might be scattered by a standard amount because the electrons always seek a standard balance in their pressure between each other. They always share their pressure. They always repel each other in the same amount. They're always saying, stay a certain distance from me, please. That's their preference.
That the light needs to be monochromatic. This just means light.
So again, the Young experiment was done with sunlight. So obviously, the light doesn't need to be monochromatic. If you just want to be, because you'll still see the overlapping pattern, you'll see where the red shifts are, you'll see the same bars, you'll just see them in colors and they won't be piled on top of each other. But you'll still be able to tell there's a pattern. So there's no necessity that it be monochromatic.
Light of all the same frequency or wavelength. You know, mono, one, chroma, color.
Yeah, whatever. So let's do physics for what? People who haven't been born yet? Physics for fetuses?
Color is all the same frequency. You know, like red light has all the same frequency, blue light has all the same frequency.
When it doesn't actually anyway, right? You can't, it's hard to make a laser that actually shoots all the same exact frequency.
Anyway, sunlight is not monochromatic. It's made up of all the colors of the rainbow.
Right, and again, Young did the experiment with sunlight. She doesn't even know that.
Literally. And
Newton did too.
that's why we don't see interference patterns everywhere in everyday life. The slits need to be really, really, really small and the light needs to be monochromatic.
So she thinks that's the reason why we don't see it in everyday life, is because the light isn't monochromatic, which is just absolute nonsense. But the truth is, if it was monochromatic, we would see it in the sense that there are circumstances like any prismatic circumstance where we would see bars. So a oil on a surface wouldn't have colors in it, would have bars in it. And the bars would be in a different place. That's why there's a bunch of colors, is because the bars are overlapping on the primary colors, and the overlap is creating all the different colors. Whatever.
So the moral of this story is,
don't take physics seriously. Let's just make up crap, and then we'll prove it with garbage evidence. And we'll just walk around saying we did it and we understand it, when you haven't got a clue. You're not even close to getting the answer right. You've got the completely wrong answer, and here you are selling it to people. Look, I'm making educational videos telling people crap. I can't get the history right. I can't get the facts of all the experiments quite correct. And I'm doing something good for people. I'm teaching them bad, stupid, retarded, wrong things. Great. Brilliant. Not. And you're doing it in this trivial, fun little, let's just funnerize it. No.
apart from the whole, like, being a wave thing. If you're ever feeling like, you didn't do so well on that test, or sometimes you just don't get it, just remember that even geniuses like Isaac Newton get it wrong sometimes.
Isaac Newton. I don't even think I like you saying his name, but whatever, we'll see. I'll go ask him sometime. He believed in the afterlife, so, yeah. Who knows?
Sometimes. Hey, I'm wrong all the time. Maybe I'm a genius. Like,
I don't know what that was. I'm something all the time. I'm a genius. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I wouldn't vote for that. I'd vote that that's another fact you got wrong.
bye guys. See you soon.
Yes, more fun, trivial bullshit. Thank you, girly physics people. It just is disappointing that there's just no YouTube, whatever these things are, these physics fun videos done by anybody serious. But, the men aren't very serious either. But there are some that just get to the thing they're getting and explain it, and they may tell a couple of jokes, but they don't do all this nonsense what the girls resort to. And as a feminist, it just kind of disappoints me that they don't, they should just do it better. They shouldn't do it like men, but they shouldn't do it like girls. They should do it like a responsible scientist. And nobody wants to do it that way. A serious one. Somebody who takes the truth seriously, understands that it's important that we get these answers right, not wrong, in understanding everything. I mean, clearly politics and, social engineering and lots of other subjects are dependent in a way of understanding this elemental function, understanding our real ancestry on this planet as bugs, and that we really aren't advancing much beyond bug behavior. This is kind of just bug behavior. Let's appeal to, little adolescent male curiosities. I like my physics with some, chick in it. It's just feeding people candy. And it's not even, it's like poisonous candy. Yeah, that's exciting. I hate this planet. So anyway, that's enough. Another horrible pile of crap from the physics institution. This is what they've created. This is what the professors create, as physicists. Ugh. Failure. Dismal failure. All right. I've said my piece. So, till the next time, and such.